All right, well, thanks very much for hanging in there and coming to hear about some sort of fairly different approaches than what you've heard about so far. So I want to step back and ask, what are we trying to do as cognitive neuroscientists? And you can think about a couple of different types of questions we might want to ask, right? One is, what are the neural correlates of some particular mental process, be it memory or moving your hand or whatever? Another type of question we might ask is, what does a particular brain area do? What does area Z do? What does that little spot in the anterior cingulate do? And if we, the kind of standard approach that imaging people have taken since its inception has been really mostly going after this kind of like, what are the neural correlates of mental process X? So we wiggle something in the mind, right? We have you do a task, and we look at what in the brain wiggles at the same time. So if I care about working memory maintenance, I give you a task that manipulates that. We look at what brain areas move with that task. That tells us one thing. It tells us that working memory is sufficient to activate that brain area. It doesn't tell us that working memory is necessary to activate that brain area. It could be that everything activates that brain area. And it also doesn't tell us that that brain area is either necessary or sufficient for engaging in that psychological function. There's a lot of examples of cases where something activates, but the brain area turns out to not be necessary. You can have a lesion and be fine. ACC is a big culprit there. Okay, come on. So if we want to know what does the anterior cingulate do, one thing we could do is go across studies and see what causes it to light up. And it turns out that pretty much everything causes it to light up. This is a bunch of meta-analyses done using neurosynth, which you've heard about, for various things like maintenance, pain, interference, errors, difficulty. Everything makes the anterior cingulate light up. And in fact, it lights up in at least a quarter of all imaging studies that are in that database. So why is that? Okay, why is that? It could be that there's some confound that's driving this, right? That whenever we do a task, we breathe harder, and that's driving it. And actually, I'm not sure that we've ruled out all of those potential confounds. It could be that there's a distinct function subserved by different subsets of neurons within the anterior cingulate. There's a pain column and a difficulty column, and so on. It could be that the ACC serves all these different functions in different contexts. So when it's talking to motor cortex, it's subserving one function. When it's talking to periaqueductal gray, it's subserving another. Another potential that we've been really interested in is whether these aren't really truly distinct functions at all. Psychologists think they are. What if they aren't? It could well be that we're chopping up the mind in the wrong way, and I want to make the claim that we wouldn't really know if we were. And in order to make that point, I want to give you a thought experiment that actually comes from a paper written a long time ago by Daniel Bubb. What if the phrenologists had gotten their hands on fMRI? So remember our friends the phrenologists, come on, had a bunch of things that they thought were parts of the mind, like human nature and vitativeness and alimentativeness and suavity, right? So let's say that my lab studies suavity. So I have my Poldrack suavity task that we're going to take into the scanner. And so, we'll do that by basically showing people pictures of some suave people and some not so suave people and ask what happens. And what would happen. I would find an area in the brain that lights up for suavity. I'm pressing as hard as I can. And we'd get a Nature paper on the neural evidence for suavity, right? What this suggests to us is that the simple fact that something lights up doesn't mean that that function is a meaningful thing. So one thing that we really have to do, I'm just going to get you to forward the slide. So next slide. We really need to figure out what are the parts of the mind that we're trying to map onto the brain, and then once we have that, we can sort of systematically test where we're getting it right, where we're getting it wrong. Now the phrenologists had one particular way of chopping things up. Next slide. We as cognitive psychologists have various ways of chopping it up. Next slide. And various, so I think that memory is a thing, declarative memory is a kind of memory, and so on. Next slide. Other people may have different ways of chopping it up. In fact, there's probably as many of these different graphs as there are psychologists who study these things. Next. So we set out a few years ago to try to basically understand and characterize what are all the parts of the mind that psychologists think exist, so then we can go about actually trying to figure out where do they map systematically onto brain function. So we developed a project called the Cognitive Atlas, which is meant to be sort of an open, collaborative knowledge base that describes all the things that the mind does and all the ways that we measure those things. And we've also added a lot of stuff like disorders. Next slide. So the fundamental distinction in the cognitive atlas is between what we call mental concepts and mental tasks. So mental concepts are things that we think the mind does, things that exist in the mind, things like response suppression or task set reconfiguration or executive function, right? Those are things that are in the head. We as psychologists have tasks that we give people to do, to test those things. So we characterize those separately. I think one thing that the field often does is kind of mixing together. They'll call something a working memory task, when often it's not even clear that that task is really tapping into the construct of working memory. The NBAC is a famous example of that. So we try to be really clear about distinctions between mental concepts on the one hand and mental tasks on the other, and then we try to characterize these relationships in terms of which mental concepts are measured by which particular contrast on psychological tasks. Next slide. So if you go to the Cognitive Atlases at cognitiveatlas.org, there's pages for each of these concepts that says things like, spatial working memory is a kind of working memory is a kind of memory, and so on. Obviously, you can disagree about some of these things, and there's a lot of ways in the Cognitive Atlas to try to express that disagreement. Next slide. Currently, we have about 770 mental constructs, 610 tasks that overlap heavily with the CogPo database. And we have a formal, I didn't want to use the O word, but we have a formal ontology if you want it. Next slide. Okay, so what is it useful for? What can you actually do with this? I want to talk about a couple of examples. The first is actually using it to annotate data. So you've already seen examples of using meta-analytic databases. We're using a database that, rather than using coordinate-based data, uses actual raw fMRI data. So we started the OpenfMRI database a few years ago. It's now up to about 1,400 data sets. And if you go to openfMRI.org, you can download as much fMRI data as you want. Next. One of the things that we've done within OpenfMRI is tagged each of the tasks with labels from the Cognitive Atlas. So if you go, for example, to this data set that uses a probabilistic classification task, if you click on that link, it'll take you to the Cognitive Atlas page that describes that task and talks about those particular conditions, and then you can look at contrast across those conditions and ask what psychological functions do we think are being tapped by those constructs. The database is kind of a evolving, living organism, and we're still doing a lot of work to add new content. And I hope that many of you have expertise in particular domains of tasks or psychological processes. We'd love to get you involved in coming in and annotating those particular areas. So feel free to email me if you're interested in doing that. Next slide. Okay, so a few years ago we did kind of an initial proof of concept of how can we actually use this. So the idea was take a bunch of data. This was sort of the first incarnation of OpenfMRI. It was a data set with 130 people each doing one of 8 different tasks. We coded the task using a very preliminary cognitive ontology, kind of Cognitive Atlas 0.1. And then we tried to map brain systems onto the ontology. So now we're not trying to map onto tasks, we're trying to map onto psychological functions that are sort of differently captured across multiple tasks. Next. So here's what that task coding looks like. So each column is a task. These are 8 different tasks. And in each case, we just have a contrast between task and sort of resting or fixation baseline. And then we just took a bunch of these kind of very rough features that were taken from the brain map behavioral domains ontology. And we coded each task as to whether we thought it included or it involved that particular psychological process. Next. So then what we did was we basically tried to train an artificial neural network classifier to learn which of those 8 tasks the person was doing. So we give it as input, sort of a reduced version of the brain activity. The output is which of the 8 tasks are performing it. What we're going to do is we're interested in the classification, but we're also interested in using it to, as a low-dimensional representation of these high-dimensional brain images. Next. So if we look at classification accuracy, we can do quite well. So we're doing 1 out of 8, chances around 12%. We're up at around 70–80%. Not surprising, they're very different types of tasks. So it's perhaps not surprising we can pull them apart. Next. If we cluster subjects based on those hidden unit patterns, so we train the classifier, for each subject we take out the hidden unit pattern from them, and we cluster them, and then sort of color code by the different tasks. Each leaf here is a subject. So you see that there's relatively good consistency of tasks sort of falling together, not surprisingly because we built the classifier to do that. What we're really interested in now knowing is is there a relationship between kind of each of these different hidden units and the different psychological functions. Next. So what we do is we generate what we call our concept by task matrix, which you already saw, and a task by dimension matrix, which is basically averaging across subjects on each task across each of those 6 dimensions. And then we basically put those together to get a concept by dimension mapping. That's basically saying for each of those 6 neural dimensions, how does it map onto each of those 20-something psychological concepts? And here's an example of what you see. This is one of the concepts where the loading is primarily in the superior temporal gyrus, a little bit in the sort of superior medial cortex. Loads heavily on audition, but also on some of these other features. Next. Here's another one. The neural pattern is heavily in the basal ganglia and thalamus, and then also in the medial prefrontal cortex. Loads heavily on decision making. So the idea here is that we can start to pull out these sort of multidimensional mappings across cognitive functions. And you can imagine if we start seeing that multiple cognitive functions are always going together, it could be that the tasks are driving them to go together. We may have to build better tasks, but it could also be that they aren't really different things from the brain standpoint. Next. So we've subsequently done much bigger analyses using the extended OpenfMRI data set. In a paper a couple years ago, we published one with 26 tasks and 338 subjects. Next. And what we see is that using whole brain data, we can do this 1 out of 26 classification with about 47% accuracy, where chance is down at a few percent. Interestingly, if we use ICA to do dimensionality reduction, we see that we can actually do pretty well at classification even down to like 10 components. So what that tells you is that these tasks are largely being pulled apart by relatively broad, kind of low-dimensional networks rather than really fine-grained patterns, which may not be surprising. Next. We can also then take the confusion matrix from that classifier and ask, how do different tasks get confused? And what we see is that, at least in some occasions, we find that the same task in different studies will actually end up clustering and confusing together in this matrix, suggesting again that we are pulling out some degree of really kind of task-specific stuff. Next. Now that didn't really get us where we wanted to get. Where we really want to get is to decoding actual cognitive functions. So I want to take a brain image and not say this person's doing task X, Y, or Z. I want to say they're engaging in this particular aspect of working memory and this particular kind of motor response and this particular type of stimulus and so on. So that goes from being a multi-class problem, which is which of these 26 things are you doing, to a multi-label problem, which is of these many processes, many of them could be turned on, which in particular are turned on. So Sammy Koyejo and I did some work a few years ago, presented at NIPS, that started looking at this, where basically he took that same data set, took that coding, and sort of fleshed it out a bit, and then basically asked, can we do this multi-label classification? Can we predict for any particular data set which of those 20-something cognitive functions are turned on, where any number of them can be turned on from one task to another? And it turns out that we can do fairly well at that. We're not anywhere near ceiling, of course, but we can actually do pretty well, and certainly much better than the popularity, though we end up doing best on the things that are most popular in the data set. The contrasts that are the processes that are there most often, we have more data on, so obviously we're going to do better on. Next. In recent work, Yannick Schwartz from Gael Veracroix's lab has sort of pushed this even further to build an ontology into the decoder to basically use knowledge about the relationship between these functions to actually build an ontology-driven decoder, and has shown one that you can actually perform very well at predicting, again, this multi-label problem, predicting which cognitive functions are turned on. And you can also do a much better job of generating maps that show what brain regions are actually driving that turn out, at least for the ones where we have a good expectation, to make a lot of sense. Next. Okay, so I'm going to tell you about one other example of how we've used this, and this is as a way to sort of do text mining. And so we used a technique called topic modeling. The idea behind this is that papers are generated based on a set of sort of latent topics, and those topics represent distributions across words. And so you can use it next. You can use a technique called latent Dirichlet allocation to estimate, given a bunch of documents, what are the latent topics and what are the words that are associated with each of those topics, and how does each document relate to each topic. So we did that first on the text from the Neurosynth database. Then we did what we call topic mapping, where we basically say, okay, now what we have for each document, it's loading on each of these different topics. How does that relate to brain activity? So we can come up with maps that basically show where in the brain is activation, now in a kind of coordinate-based way, associated with loading on that topic. Next. So here's just one example. These are the terms. So what we did was we took the neurosynth full text and pulled out only the terms that are in the cognitive atlas. So we get a very focused topic model that's just using terms that are about psychological functions. Otherwise, you get authors' names and parts of the brain and things about papers and so on. So this one is, you can see it's all terms related to specifically to working memory. And this is the map that you get, and it looks very much like maps that you've seen in other meta-analyses. Again, this is a proof of concept, just to show that we can, once we have that ontology, now we can use it to drive meta-analyses in a much more focused way than we could if we were just looking across all the words that were in those documents, for example. So here's an example, I think, of how we might think about trying to do this, ultimately to test whether we're chopping things up right or wrong. So. And I'm going to do it just with behavioral measures here. So let's say we have 4 different behavioral measures, and I have a theory that says, that these 2 measures are related to something called inhibition, these 2 are related to something called updating. Next. And it's important to note that those imply a particular covariance structure for those measures, right? These 2 should be more correlated with one another because they have this latent factor in common. Next. Now, somebody else might think that, oh, it's all just something we call executive function. And next. And that implies a different covariance structure. Next. So what we can do then is take the covariance, we can take it across behavior, brain imaging, whatever, next, and ask which of these is most similar. Next. And we can say, yeah, this one actually looks most similar. So that tells us that we've actually, this particular theory must be chopping things up in the right way. Next. Okay, so 3 seconds left. I hope I've convinced you that ontologies are a useful and interesting thing to bring to bear on trying to understand how the mind maps to the brain, and that we can really start to think about testing fundamental conceptual frameworks using this sort of approach. And next. And just thank all the various folks who've been involved in this, and thank you.
Maybe time for one question for Russ. So I seem to remember that the Cognitive Atlas has a kind of a social aspect. I mean, so how does that work? Can anyone come in and just sort of start adding topics or
Yes, you have to, basically, the idea is that anybody who has a background in this area, we give an account to. You go on the site, you apply for an account, and anybody who has any expertise, we give an account to, and you can go in and do things. And it's sort of like a Wikipedia model where, Wikipedia, if you want to make big changes, in general, you want to kind of propose them in the discussion first before you go make them, because if you make big changes that nobody agrees with, they're just going to get reverted. So we've adopted that model. We haven't had a lot of people outside of my lab contributing, and that's part of why I'm trying to bring people on board. I mean, I think it's hitting a critical mass now of the amount of knowledge in there where it's really going to become useful for kind of pushing, taking the kind of stuff I talked about that Yannick Schwartz has done and pushing that out into kind of full, full cognitive decoding.
Yeah. Okay, great. Let's thank Russ one more time.